1. Step on. Oh God, I could be bounded in a nutshell, and count myself a king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams. Hamlet. William Shakespeare. Ace sat bolt upright in bed and didn't cry out. She did what she'd done since she was little, looking around her room to make sure that everything was as it should be. Of course, this was a strange kind of room, a dormitory in the TARDIS. Still, with her Happy Mondays posters, hi-fi and cool box full of explosives, Ace felt more at home here than she had anywhere else. And, of course, everything was fine. The room reacted to her waking, brightening slightly so that she could see every corner. She had dreamt... what? Home stuff, probably, wishing she could go back and use a creative Nitro 9 where it most mattered. But still... She rubbed her face with her hand. Well, naff dream. Ace was in her early 20s, but had wisdom beyond her years. The instinctive wisdom of a wanderer in the fourth dimension. She had a face that could be soft and beautiful, but would suddenly frown in a dangerous anger, an anger that could blow the world apart for its sins. Which was sometimes how she felt. Ace held certain things to be important. These, in order, were loyalty, street cred, and high explosives. So maybe she was a couple of pounds over fashionable, but it was all muscle, and she liked her bacon sarnies too much to care. Besides, if she ever met Tim Booth, he'd love her for a mind, wouldn't he? There'd be trouble otherwise. She heard it then, far off in the darkened corridors of the TARDIS. Somebody was crying out, low and distant. "Old fella, look out, man, it's inside!" "Professor?" the young woman from Perivale called, but no answer was forthcoming. Throwing back the covers, Ace went exploring in her nightie. The TARDIS was some weird kind of craft, huge on the inside, containing literally miles of gleaming corridors, a swimming pool, even a gym which Ace had set about customising. But outside, the TARDIS looked as cute and old-fashioned as something in a museum. It looked like a police box, and Ace had to look that one up, because the idea of a copper rushing around the corner to use a phone rather than a walkie-talkie was really strange. She supposed that the Doctor hadn't changed the way the thing looked because he liked it. Or not. He was, after all, an alien, right? He talked about a place called Gallifrey, a home that he didn't feel good about returning to. That suited Ace. If he didn't want to go home, he wouldn't make her go home either. In the evenings, the Doctor would serve a mug of something hot, and he and Ace would talk about history and politics and science. Then he would say that he had some loose ends to tie up, and bid her good night. These loose ends Ace supposed to be the preparation work for the Doctor's tricks. During the night she would wake up at the distant sound of landing, and be concerned. After the first time she had asked the Doctor what he did at night. "Putting props in place," he had said, "making sure some people know their lines, sometimes leaving notes on the script. All the universe is a stage, Ace. Acting's not enough for me. I like to direct." These little touches, the night moves in the Time Lord's game, were not apparently dangerous. They consisted of such things as moving items of furniture, research on when things happened, and making sure certain couples never met. Bit mean, that last one. However, in the time between adventures, when the Doctor was planning his next campaign, this activity usually ceased. They had only just left Kirith, and with his search for the Timewyrm drawing a blank, Ace had thought that the Doctor would actually get some sleep, or do whatever he did. Still, the activity continued. Only these days, when Ace asked him about it, he'd only say that she must have imagined it, that he'd been in his room all night. As she proceeded through the darkened labyrinth, Ace realised that she had only assumed that the Doctor slept. Sure, he locked himself in his room at night, but this was a man who didn't need to shave, right? Coming to his door, she knocked softly. "Professor, are you okay?" After a moment, the door opened a tiny crack. The Doctor, still fully dressed, glared at her like she was some dreadful thing come to kidnap him. The little boy's face was hardened with loathing, the kind of fierce disgust that only a tremendous innocent child could show, an optimist who had been wrong too many times. That look had always comforted her when the doctor applied it to his enemies, because it was real attitude. Now she understood why. It made her feel awful, tiny and weak, and thus angry. "Doctor, it's me! You were shouting!" The Time Lord blinked, realised where he was, and grinned at her, which was always beautiful to see, strange and quite funny, like some old cartoon. He opened the door a little wider. "Oh yes, sorry, nightmare." "Me too. You were shouting out though. Didn't sound like you though." "No, that's the trouble with time travel. Difficult to keep a routine. Coco?" Tossing Ace a robe, he strode off in the direction of the console room. When Ace got there, the doctor was circling the console, checking readings and flicking switches. His expression was dark, as worried as she had ever seen him. "Where are we going, Professor?" "Nowhere. Everywhere. The TARDIS is waiting for me." "There's something wrong, isn't there?" The doctor seemed to consider, and for a moment Ace felt like a kid at Christmas, about to discover that there wasn't any Santa Claus. Then he smiled again and ducked out of the room. Ace sighed and stuck her hands deep into the pockets of the robe. Her foot touched something. On the floor of the console room lay a pressure hypodermic, empty. Ace sniffed the dispatch end quickly, but she couldn't recognise the tang as anything familiar. The doctor returned, and Ace quickly pocketed the syringe. The Time Lord was carrying 2 mugs of cocoa on a tray. Ace carefully took one. Perhaps she would have said something about the hypo, but the doctor launched into one of his rare explanations, and it was never a good idea to miss those. "I'm worried. Ever since Kirith, the Timewyrm has vanished from the TARDIS's tracking equipment, which means it's in hiding. That's always the way with evil, devious, subtle." Ace realised with a sigh that the doctor was talking more to himself than to her. Their course over the last few days had been erratic, a series of desperate attempts to detect temporal disruption. They had landed in Lewisham in 1977 and visited a pub called the Rose of Lee. They had prowled the streets of Rome in 1582. They had sat and meditated on the Eye of Orion. It was as if the doctor was trying to see a pattern, divine some meaning in these varied events. He seemed desperate. "Dreams are the reason for sleep, Ace. There's no point in sleeping unless you dream. Do you ever get the feeling that somebody is trying to tell you something?" "No." Ace was going to say something about the doctor's general lack of consultation, but he was off again, returning with what appeared to be an ancient glazed pot. "King Wen's gift, the I Ching, for services rendered." He overturned the pot on the floor, and out fell a jumble of sticks. "Professor, what?" "Shh! A simple macroscopic oracle. Reflects the universe in a small action. Our perceptions depend on scale, as above, so below." He set one stick aside and divided the stack into 2 piles. Then he proceeded to speed through a complex procedure, holding the sticks in his fingers, throwing them back into the pile, and swiftly counting. Finally, he leapt up and fed a series of numbers into the TARDIS computer. The combination of the sticks suggests a series of numbers, 541322 in this case, and let the rest sort themselves out randomly. The central column began to rise and fall with new purpose, locked onto a course. "So, what are we heading for now?" Ace stood up. "Adventure. Conflict." The doctor smiled his secretive smile, and Ace grinned back. "What? Deadly danger?" "Yes. You'd better get dressed." The TARDIS spun through the vortex, its exterior reflecting the spiralling purples of the time corridor. By the time Ace had pulled on some leggings and a hooded farm t-shirt, and grabbed her jacket and rucksack from the bedside cabinet, they had landed. The doctor plucked his umbrella from the hat stand, adjusted his own headgear, and walked straight out into the unknown, not bothering to look at the scanner. He did that a lot these days. Following, Ace hoped he knew what he was doing and was not just showing off. He always seemed to, but a bit like a stage magician, the doctor didn't like to reveal how his tricks worked. That was fine if you were in the audience, but scary if you were the rabbit waiting in the hat. A full moon blazed over a snow-covered landscape, a dense forest and marshlands beyond where sheets of ice reflected the moonlight. In the distance shone the lights of a village. The air was crisp and clear, with a bite of frost, and the countryside lay silent, expectant. Ace zipped up her jacket. "Countryside? Nasty! Do you think so?" "Yeah, bad things can happen to you out here and nobody knows. There's nobody around to help." They started to trudge through the snow, the doctor licking a finger to estimate the wind direction. "I remember Sherlock Holmes expressing similar sentiments." "Yeah?" Ace was interested. "Did you meet him? Oh, right, he wasn't real, was he?" "Just because somebody isn't real, it doesn't mean you can't meet them," murmured the doctor with a sly smile. Ace paused for a moment as he carried on. "Right," she said, and followed. They came to a ridge overlooking the village, and the doctor nodded to himself. A cluster of thatched buildings huddled around a village green. A little way off lay a blacksmith's, and a coaching inn beamed with welcoming noise and light. "Cheldon Boniface, Norfolk, England, Earth." "Middle 19th century by the look of the buildings. I'd better be careful." "Careful? Why?" "I might be here. I visited this place on several occasions." Ace frowned, boggling at the concept of two doctors in the same place. "Would that be so bad?" "Potentially catastrophic. No such thing as coincidence. No, somehow I think we're playing a different game this evening." And suddenly, as if he had revealed too much, he changed the subject. "Do you know where the word ace comes from?" They started to descend the hill. "No?" "From the Latin, as a unit of weight." "Cheers, Professor." The French usage came to be applied to a pilot who had shot down 10 enemy aircraft. He carried on this conversation until they reached the inn, a jolly-looking place with horses tethered in a stable. The painted sign that creaked outside named it as the Black Swan. And of course, there's the expression to bait an ace. What does that mean? It means giving your opponent an initial advantage, making yourself appear equal. Nothing to do with using an ace as bait, then? Not at all. After you. He waved her into the inn. It was the noise that hit her first. The landlord, a huge portly chap with bushy sideburns and a ruddy complexion, was struggling to reach a table, carrying a tray brimming with foaming tankards. The crowd that surrounded him, merry-looking villagers, travellers still in snow-covered boots, and various musicians and beggars, were making a huge, joyous row, singing carols. Ace felt like joining in. Then she realised with a start that things wouldn't be as easy as all that. Her leggings weren't really the height of chic in the last century. Was she going to be fending off drunken toe rags all night? "It's all right," muttered the doctor, closing the door behind them. "Nobody will notice." He squeezed his way to the bar and called out to the plump woman who was slopping hot mead into mugs. "Martha, what time is it?" The woman looked up and beamed, laughing. "Doctor! We haven't seen you in years, but you always ask that question. It's just past 10 o'clock on Christmas Eve." "Really?" the doctor yelled back. "Is there room at the inn?" "Now, don't you be quoting scripture at me," Martha laughed. "We've got 2 rooms," she winked at the doctor. "Will you be needing both?" "Ah, yes." The doctor seemed shy for a moment. "As well you know. I must have a word with George." "Well, when he's got a moment. George, look who's here." George, who turned out to be the landlord, looked up from his discussion with a ragged tinker. For a moment Ace thought he seemed worried. Then he broke into a laugh. "Doctor, from the family of doctors. How's the young lad?" The doctor found his hand pumped a little too heartily. "Oh, he's fine. Still playing his cricket. I need your rooms." "You have 'em. You're the sort of guest I like in an open house, not like that lot." He nodded at the group of tinkers taken in out of the cold on this special night. "Half a trade between the lot of them. To tell you the truth," he leaned closer, "I've been wanting a word with somebody who has a bit of book learning. Fancy a game of chess?" The doctor nodded, intrigued. Ace had quietly ordered herself a mug of mead and had sat down amongst the tinkers, grinning. With their moppy hair and carefully bound packs, they reminded her of the anarcho-punks she had known in her own time. "Hi, I'm Ace." The hardy men regarded her with amazement. "Well, you're a bawdy lass. A bit liquorish, I fancy," began a man with an ocarina. This prompted general laughter. Ace glared. "I don't know what that meant, toe rag, but it didn't sound friendly." "Oh, don't be insulted, madame." The interloper was an Irishman in a dusty top hat. "We're just enjoying the hospitality before George closes the place down and ushers us off to church at midnight. I'm Rafferty. This is the Mrs. Bridget." A lean, rosy-cheeked woman nodded at Ace. "For myself, if a bit of praying gets me an inch of hospitality in this world, I don't mind." "Into God, George, is he? A fearing man." Ace sucked the mead gently, relishing the honey taste and the herbs floating on top. The doctor tapped her shoulder discreetly and spoke in a low murmur. "Having fun?" "Yeah, well historical. I'm off to do a bit of research. You've got the room at the top of the stairs. Meet you there in half an hour." "Okay." He moved away, but returned on an afterthought. "And no more mead." Ace sighed and placed her elbows on the table. "Well then, who's for a sing-song?" The doctor climbed the stairs beside George, who carried a candle. The light flickered around the stairwell, and the shadows that crossed the landlord's face emphasised what the doctor had suspected. The man was scared of the dark. He opened the door of the little upstairs parlour and lit a lamp, checking the shutters over the window. Then he produced a chess set and set it up on the old oak table. "Your customers will miss you," the doctor sat, showing only curiosity. "Not this late. Martha can put some more pies and ale down 'em. Been practising, doctor?" "Not against a worthwhile opponent," the Time Lord replied, allowing himself slight relish. "White, please." They began to play, the doctor holding back, waiting for George to attack. "There's been some bother at the church," the landlord began after a while. "Bother?" "Reverend Trelaw, acting odd-like. He thinks the place is haunted." The doctor smiled slightly. "It might be. But he's been seeing things round the place. Demons, he says." The doctor's face assumed the aspect of a hunter who has sighted game. George took a pawn. He was developing a strong position. "And you're going there tonight?" "For midnight mass, as always." "Good. We'll come along." "Yes." George looked up, smiling, having taken another of the doctor's pieces. "I was hoping you would." Ace was getting tired. Her biological clock, she reasoned, thought it was about 4 a.m, and the mead hadn't helped. She stood up. "Leaving us then?" Rafferty called. "Afraid so. Not exciting enough for me down here." "And will it be exciting up there?" Ace slapped her forehead with the palm of her hand, exasperated, and headed for the stairs, making a mental note to wedge a chair behind her door. Martha called after her to be back down for midnight, and she nodded. The room, it turned out, was cool, a big old bed and a jug on the dresser. Ace dropped her rucksack onto the bed and opened the shutters on the window, noticing that the room was lit by a lamp. The forest rustled in the moonlight, deep and silent. That was another reason she didn't like the countryside. Too quiet. She needed the hum of traffic or the TARDIS to get to sleep. Not that that was going to be a problem here. The doctor would be up in about 20 minutes, full of plans and strategies. Ace hoped that for once he was wrong, that this calm place held no clue to the Timewyrm's hiding place. She lay on the bed, hands behind her head. Well, maybe she would just take a rest. She'd locked the door after all. Within a minute she was asleep. "I'm afraid of these demons. They're beyond my knowledge. And what's beyond, well, that frightens us all, eh, Doctor?" The doctor had been intently scrutinising George's face, as if looking for something in the innkeeper's expression. His concentration had so left the game that he was in danger of losing. George glanced back at the board, moved a piece, and made that potential loss into a real one. "That's the first time I've beaten you," he grinned. "Is it?" the doctor frowned. "But what about the time—" He glanced up at the innkeeper again and smiled his giddy smile. "Yes, Of course, you're right. His expression hardened, his eyes seeming to pierce the veil of space and time. Don't worry, he whispered. I'll rid you of your demons. George's expression, which had become suddenly tense, eased. Yes, Doctor, he sighed. Of course you will. The Doctor and George descended the stairs once more. The inn had quietened a little, and the Doctor noted that Ace had left to keep their appointment. He ordered a mince pie and sat down with the villagers. Come on, lads, called George. There's still a while before midnight. Let's have another song. Ace was dreaming about school. Rows and rows of desks, all the same, and she was using a chisel to slam her initials into one. The teacher, an uptight fascist with a juddering lip, was yelling at her to stop, and in his hands he held a box. A musical box. Wound up and ready to play. But this box could hide a secret inside. Can you guess what is in it today? Oh, it's the Doctor. Where are you going, Doctor? I see, you're going out into space to battle alien monsters. May we come with you? But as the Doctor was nodding yes, a boy at the back of the class stood up and marched forwards through the chattering ranks. He stopped at Ace's desk and glared at her. Chad Boyle, the motherless creep who'd... Dotty, he grinned. No, this was her dream. She ought to be able to control it. The first thing that you learn in school is that evil is not just the absence of good. Evil is real. The second thing you learn is that you, he grabbed her by the hair and raised his blood-dripping brick, will never be an astronaut. And there was an astronaut bending over her desk, his helmet reflecting her face. She shouted, woke up, so she thought, but there was still her own face, distorted, inches above her. A pressure hypo slammed up into the vein under her chin, and Ace fell back onto the bed, shuddering. The astronaut was short, only about 4 feet tall. It looked around the bedroom as if impressed, then reached out and touched Ace, checking her pulse. With a rough movement, it scooped her up in its hands and stepped smoothly towards the window. The leap carried it slowly to the ground, like an alien snowflake gently descending. A light, chilling breeze fluttered the curtains with its passing. Much to Martha's consternation, George had started to sing. He was soon accompanied by the beating of tankards and the purr of a squeeze box. From out of a wood did a cuckoo fly, cuckoo. He came to a manger with a joyful cry, cuckoo. He hopped, he curtsied, round he flew, and loud his jubilation grew, cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo. The Doctor yawned and stood up stretching. It's getting late. I think I'd better check on Ace. George laughed, perhaps noting that the Doctor's expression had once more become alert. She's probably not used to the mead. Come on, you haven't even touched your pie. The Doctor relaxed, picked up the pie, and was about to take a big bite. What time is it anyway? George glanced at his wrist. The Doctor dived for the stairs. The villagers leapt up and rushed after him, their hands catching at his coattails, ripping the fabric. The Doctor fended off a few with his umbrella, tripping the leader. Seize him! Shouted George, incensed. Why? Martha was calling. What's he done? The Doctor broke free and sprinted up the stairs, cannoning off Ace's locked door. He looked around, then jumped into the parlour, shoving the big table up against the door. Heavy thumps rang from the other side. He pulled open the shutters and examined the window. Old-fashioned leading, he couldn't break it. He paused, suddenly calm. Or perhaps, he murmured, I can. Closing his eyes, the Doctor shoved at the window blindly, and it came free, falling into the night. The door gave way, sending the table across the room, and the Doctor threw himself out of the window. A moment's drop, and then he was rolling in freezing snow. Villagers burst out of the front of the inn, and he sprinted off into the forest. The wild-eyed villagers' cries followed him. Wait, instructed George. We don't want him damaged. He'll come back. George's brawny hands ripped apart the pie that the Doctor had been about to consume and searched for something in the moist mixture of fruit and pork. He quickly found it. Mistletoe. The kiss of death. George smiled and held it above his wife's head. Eyes full of fear, Martha kissed the thing she thought had been her husband. The tiny astronaut bounded across the countryside, carrying Ace in its arms. The leaps it took were high and long, arching above the shining white ground and landing with graceful impacts and little snow flurries. All was silent. The being kept looking down at its burden and shaking its head, as if it couldn't quite understand the situation either. Ace was dreaming the same old dreams, rings of children, either distant and unyielding, or around her, kicking, hair-pulling, spitting on her, dirty Dotty, and all because of Mum. Chad Boyle had been a curse to her then, a name that she couldn't be rid of. At home, in her little bedroom full of moon posters and music, and listen, her music had always been better than the crap they liked at school. She wouldn't even think of the name. It meant dirt in your face and the burn of tarmac against your skin. It meant having to fight for everything, for every ounce of respect, and fighting didn't achieve anything. No matter how good you were at it, the other kids knew the rules. Girls didn't fight boys, boys didn't fight girls. Dotty didn't belong. Of course, Chad broke the secret rules too, by picking on Dorothy in the first place. All she would have had to do was to say, "What's the matter, fancy me, do you?" and he would have been shamed away. Or maybe not. Maybe he had fancied her, and that was what drove his stupid, underage brain to go beyond all the rules. Meeting her outside the door of her house, tormenting her in lessons, not caring if the teacher saw. The whole time these awful years were just pain and chalk dust to Ace now. She had got out, grew up, made new friends in seniors, friends who were outsiders too. She had become a real person. Or maybe not. Ace opened her eyes and saw the white countryside rushing up to meet her. This was real. Good! As the astronaut compacted his legs for another leap, Ace jerked violently in his grasp. They both fell in a plume of snow, rolling over, and the woman dived on her abductor, punching him in the chest. A moment later she was free of his grasp, and just had time to glimpse the slight stature of her opponent before turning and sprinting away towards the forest. The first thing to do was to get some trees between them. At least the astronaut had obliged her by bringing her rucksack along. Jumping into some bushes, Ace turned to see what the enemy was doing. He was climbing to his feet and clutching his helmet in agony, yelling with pain. She hadn't hit him that hard. Then suddenly the pain appeared to cease, and the astronaut looked around, the snowy slope and trees reflecting in his faceplate. Ace ducked down. She was starting to realise just how groggy she felt, her head swimming with strange dreams and fractal patterns of splintering time. This was turning out to be an interesting Christmas. Carefully crossing the marshes, the doctor had slowed to walking pace. His face was a picture of concentration and no little worry. Eventually, he came to the small hill atop which was St. Christopher's Church. "Saul!" the doctor called with a hint of desperation. "I need your help!" But no answer came. The church was dark and silent, sullen before the trees that protected it from the blast of the wind. The doctor grasped the handles on the ancient doors and threw them open. Frozen dankness greeted him from within. The pews were cold and damp, and the smell of rot was everywhere. Dead flowers lay like sticks in their vases. Frost had claimed the golden eagle of the lectern. "Saul!" called the doctor again. "Are you there?" Quickly he ran up the aisle. There was no psychic residue, no sign of the presence in the church. The doctor's face darkened as he prowled the building, examining the brickwork and almost offhandedly checking a certain piece of masonry. Finally he rushed back to the threshold. Closing the doors, he stared back towards the village. That way fear lay. Fear and a very real threat of insanity. "Evil must be confronted," he muttered. It was as if he was trying to convince himself. The doctor took a deep breath and marched off to deliver himself to his enemies. In modern-day Sheldon Boniface, Reverend Trelaw was having a hard time with his sermon, and in these troubled times we must take heart from the more eventful periods in the life of our Lord on earth. Well, that is to say, eventful isn't quite... Oh dear. The vicar fumbled with his spectacles. Peter Hutchins was frowning in the way that people do when they actually want to burst out in thunderous laughter. He was biting his cheeks so hard that it hurt. At the start of the sermon, he had been silently musing on knot theory, but Trelaw's extraordinary delivery had caught his attention. Besides, His brain seemed reluctant to discuss mathematics with him this morning. Every time he started to formulate a 9-dimensional knot equation, things seemed to get out of hand, and he lost track. It was as if something was undoing his knots. He glanced at Emily. Thank God she was enjoying the sight too. He was only here for her sake. Neither of the Hutchins was particularly religious, but, in a towny sort of way, Emily had thought that the local church was the best way to really integrate with the community. Or that was what she had said, another one of her hunches. It was a bit out of character for a woman whose interest in religion went only as far as weddings and christenings. Lord, she was beautiful, even after all she had been through. Peter remembered her face when she had lost Thomas, the echoing pain of it, then the vacuum that had replaced it when the doctors had told her that she'd never be able to have another and live. If not for him, she might have tried anyway. Feeling his laughter turning to tears, Peter gently touched his wife's hair. Trelaw looked up at the baffled faces of his congregation. He was angry with himself. It was the feeling of expectation that was getting to him, the taste of change that had come with the frost. It had given him stage fright after years of perfect performances. It had made his audience restless, and he himself a bad orator. "And, well, I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions," he muttered. "Now we'll, Hymn number 64, whispered Saul. "Yes, that one," Trelaw told the audience. There was a puzzled murmur. "Hymn number 64, I mean," the vicar added, wishing that he had decided to become a plumber. Ace had picked up a stout log and was swinging it comfortingly before her as she picked her way through the woods, back towards where she thought the village was. A different kind of light illuminated the trees ahead, and she hoped it was the first sign of habitation. Now that she thought about it, there was something awfully familiar about the spacesuit that the creature wore. It was exactly the same as the ones that the doctor had showed her at the dusty end of the TARDIS wardrobe room. They had been looking for things to wear to a costume party in High Barnet, and Ace had suggested the spacesuits. The doctor had declined, saying that they didn't want to upset the Edwardians, and that he was saving the suits for a snowy day. Oh, shame. It jumped out of the trees in front of her, helmet gleaming in the snow. If Ace was honest with herself, this dwarf astronaut was shaking her up. The way its face just reflected hers, the way it scampered with a kind of insane glee, not quite afraid of what she might do, just wanting to see. Her head was so full of dreams now that moments came and went where the creature was just a figment, a sweet little phantom. The thing's gloved fingers curled and uncurled, and it moved from foot to foot, sizing her up. Ace gripped the log more tightly. "Come and get it, Shorty!" she called. The small being leaped at her, feet first. Ace stepped aside, allowing it to crumple in a heap on the icy ground. Hard as she wasn't callous enough to smash the log down on it, so she just tried to threaten the creature as it regained its feet. "I'm not afraid to use this, pal!" Heedless, the astronaut pulled open a buttoned pouch and drew a gun. Too far to smack it aside, Ace feinted with the log and ran, scrambling up the hill. A blast of scarlet light blew a nearby tree into spraying liquid pulp. Clear shot that was, Ace reflected. If the little squirt was trying to kill her, he was an awful shot. She dived into a bramble bush, regretting it almost instantly, and, the thorns tearing at her, wrestled to keep moving. She had a vague impression of reaching the edge of the forest. Glancing behind her, she ripped free of the bush and sprinted for freedom, into the light. The blazing light. Her feet scuffed a huge cloud of grey-brown dust. For a moment, Ace was too stunned to comprehend what she saw. She had reached the edge of the forest all right. There it lay behind her, covered in snow, and the village and the marshes and all, in a lunar crater. Above her shone not the moon, but something impossible, something that long ago had stared down from her bedroom wall. Clouds and seas and greenery, the earth as seen from space. The last vestiges of atmosphere trailed away from the momentum of her run, and her last footstep sent her sailing up off the surface. "Dog!" burst from her lungs, and then she found she couldn't draw another breath. The last thought that Ace managed as she spun into the lunar surface was that she'd made it after all. One small step for man, one giant blunder for the girl from Perivale. It seemed as if she could see her own face again, smiling in death.